This is a Reuters story by Nichola Groom. First U.S. offshore wind auction in Gulf of Mexico attracts paltry interest, which reports the underwhelming results of the first lease in the Gulf, which was the site of the disastrous Deepwater Horizon oil spill over a decade ago. John, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, going into this, the trade groups, advocacy groups did caution that this would not be the auction that resembles like New York Bight or others in the Northeast. It wouldn't get to that multi-billion-dollar threshold, but I do still think this was a bit of a flop and a little underwhelming. So really interested to hear from Nichola on some of the insights that she's found through her reporting on this. But Mike, what did you think?
I think the Gulf is a tough place to put a wind farm. The wind is not as strong, the regulations aren't clear, the cost is high, but there's also the complications of abandoned pipelines because, of course, even with 150 years of maturity, we still don't have the oil companies paying their own way. We help them with a government allowance. To make this work, I think government's got to emphasize removing unused infrastructure and halt new oil and gas permits and get serious about offshore wind.
All right, with that, Nichola Groom, welcome to
Hey guys,
This Week
thanks
in
for having
Cleantech.
me.
Nichola, tell us about what drew you to this story, and for people who perhaps haven't read it yet, what are the really big takeaways that they should have when
Well, as you
when they
know,
hear about it?
offshore wind is a huge part of the Biden administration's decarbonization agenda. And they have been champions of this industry since Biden took office in 2021, set a very ambitious goal of deploying 30 gigawatts of offshore wind along every U.S. coastline by 2030. So expanding this industry to the Gulf of Mexico was a big deal and was touted by the president a few weeks ago as a big milestone for the offshore wind industry. So that made this story just, really interesting, especially because the Gulf, as you know, is a major oil and gas hub globally. And offshore wind auctions have been very successful in the Northeast of the United States. So it was, there were a lot of eyes on this sale in terms of people just kind of wondering how it would pan out. And I think it was less successful than many people expected. Though I'm not sure anybody thought it was going to be a runaway success, as John mentioned. And there are a few reasons for that. One is the low wind speeds, but the primary thing that I hear is, the lack of state support for offshore wind. In the Northeast, states like New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts have laws in place mandating utilities to procure offshore wind. And, states like Louisiana and Texas don't have that. Louisiana has a 5 gigawatt target, but that's not a mandate. So the one lease that did sell was the lease that's closest to Louisiana, and there's a reason for that. It's because the state has shown some support for it, but the two leases off the coast of Texas got no bids.
That's a good point. I'd like to go a little inside baseball with this because, Nichola, you've covered a lot of offshore wind over the last, couple of years. So I imagine that you were tasked with following this auction from the very beginning when it started at 9 a.m. and you're clicking refresh every hour. And I think I mentioned it in my reporting. You did as well that, 2 hours in after two rounds, it's just over. And you're kind of squinting and wondering, is that it? Did it really go that fast? The New York auction that I mentioned took days. It was like 64 rounds to complete. So kind of interested if you were surprised by that, just given that we did have some heavy hitters as those approved bidders that were supposed to be part of this process.
I was really stunned. Like you, I was like, wait, it's over? Because, even the New York Bight auction did last for days. But, the California auction, for instance, it wasn't really a runaway success, but it did take all day and, kind of the bids moved up, slowly. So I sort of expected it to be like that. And then, 2 rounds in, this auction is over, 0 bids on 2 of the leases was quite surprising, given that, 15 companies had qualified to bid, and they were all the heavy hitters that we've seen at auctions before. Total, RWE, which was the one company that did win the lease, Avangrid, Shell. Shell had filed comments saying that they were really interested in developing in the possibilities of offshore wind in the Gulf to develop green hydrogen. So, Equinor also, I was pretty surprised.
Just to jump in again, Mike, as a follow-up to that, you mentioned the green hydrogen piece, Nichola, which I think is important. That was one of the intrigues about the whole Gulf of Mexico offshore wind prospect. And even some like Houston private equity firms were approved bidders, and some other people that haven't really played in this space. Hanwha Q-Cells USA was an approved bidder, the solar manufacturer. Like there was interest, and just interested that so many sat on the sidelines. And I've been trying to reach out to those developers directly to see kind of who bid and why didn't they bid if they didn't get involved. Have you been able to pull any of that out yet?
Yeah, Total did talk to us afterwards and said that they had analyzed the market and just felt that it wasn't right for them at this time. It was one thing that was interesting to me is the concerns really were specific to the Gulf, the low wind speeds, the lack of state support, et cetera. We've seen a lot of other challenges with offshore wind in the last couple of months here in the U.S. with folks trying to renegotiate contracts in the Northeast due to cost inflation. And, those really weren't the reasons that people gave. People gave the reasons that the Gulf market in and of itself just isn't quite ready yet.
Nichola, I got a question for you. I know that in some of our work on offshore wind in the past, one of the big things that people pointed to was that the stake that the Gulf states could have in deploying parts of the supply chain for oil and gas on building out U.S. offshore wind. From my perspective, this is a little bit of a missed opportunity to really bring home the benefits to Gulf states of Gulf state supply chain presence. And I wondered if that factored at all into the thinking or the conversation you reported in this story.
I mean, when you talk to people about offshore wind in the Gulf, they will say the primary, one of the good things about it is the existing infrastructure along the Gulf, and that they weren't worried about building new ports and things like that is happening in the Northeast. There's a lot of support, at least in Louisiana. I think some of the local economic development agencies, et cetera, were very excited about this possibility of offshore wind to produce green hydrogen, to provide power to the industrial customers that sit along the coastline. To bring more jobs to the region. So I would imagine, I haven't spoken to folks since the auction. I would imagine that there may be some disappointment, but at the same time, they do have that. There is a lease now. There is a lease held off the coast of Louisiana, and it will be up to RWE to develop that lease and figure out what they're going to do with it.